I just hope the ideas here are enough to keep you awake after your lunch. What I'm going to do is sketch for you some of the thinking at a fairly early stage that we have around what is the connection between sustainability, between complexity and trying to make sense of complexity, and thinking in particular about the OER movement or an OER initiative as an ecosystem. And what do we know about ecosystems and what makes them sustainable? Okay, so that's where we're going with this. A word of introduction: we're funded by the Hewlett Foundation on a project with CMU called the Open Learning Network, OLNet. This is our mission statement, resonant of Star Trek, aiming to search out the evidence, not for other life forms, but for the use and reuse of OER. And to build a collective intelligence infrastructure that makes this visible. We want to try and create a map, or many maps, of what it is the movement seems to currently know about the impact of OER, as well as what the open challenges are. We want to try and scaffold quite large-scale ongoing discussions about what the challenges are facing the movement. And I'll say a little bit, returning to that right at the end as well. What do we mean by OER collective intelligence? So some of you may be familiar with the CI word. It's quite current at the moment. Well, here are some examples just to ground it, okay? I might say that, having surveyed the literature and having studied this widely, the following tend to be adoption obstacles for OER in Africa, or in Kenya, or in India, okay? That would be a piece of collective intelligence that I might have put together, or that a whole group of us might have put together. This is what we currently understand about OER and adoption obstacles. Or this particular OER failed to transfer to a new context from the one in which it had originally been developed because of the following reasons. And maybe this is just one OER, or maybe I see a pattern emerging, okay? Because we're talking about patterns and robust knowledge. I might say there appear to be 5 main strategies to OER sustainability, of which, in my view, only 2 have robust evidence. Okay? Another example of an answer to the question, what do we currently know about ... The following arguments for OER have proven most compelling to state educational boards. Right? Or successful OER initiatives seem to share these competencies in the core team. Right? So within the papers here at this conference, there is a lot of intelligence. And maybe some of those dots can be joined up more effectively, other than simply reading 30 papers or Googling and looking for keywords. And our goal is to try and build a better collective intelligence infrastructure, where infrastructure doesn't just mean technology, but people and processes and technology all working well together. And if we think about the kinds of evidence that might build this kind of collective intelligence, maybe we'd even call this wisdom, OER wisdom, thinking back to the opening keynote from OU and L this morning. Then we might think of a sort of archaeological metaphor that around an OER or around a particular issue, we gather layers of evidence bit by bit. And first of all, we have just compelling anecdotes, these great stories of the difference that OER made in a particular project. But it's kind of anecdotal, right? So it might be, we've just completed this first trial of this OER, didn't quite meet our hopes, but we have some idea about why, and we're chasing it up, right? It's the kind of thing you might hear from a colleague over coffee, or it's the kind of thing that somebody might just mention as new work they're just starting. Or somebody might have a case study with anecdotal, informal evidence. For example, we have the following screencasts and interview MP3s, and we're happy to share these because we need some help to analyze them. We're starting to build an evidence base, but it's not really very robust. Or maybe right at the other end of the extreme, we did some kind of controlled experiment, and we claim that using the ChemTutor OER, it was better or worse for certain kinds of students, the kind of thing you get out of a university-controlled laboratory study. And in the paper, we give the paper that you will see in the proceedings when it appears, you see other examples of these kinds of layers. These are the kinds of things floating around, and what the challenge is, how do we get these stories that are appearing around different OERs or different issues and bring them together. Okay, so this is what we are trying to do. The question is, we're trying to develop ways of thinking about what it means to build a collective intelligence infrastructure of that sort. And in this paper, we're particularly tying it to the question of sustainability. Okay, what does sustainability mean? Well, it may mean pounds, dollars, euros, and the financial nitty-gritty of how we make these things last. Okay? But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about sustainability as a property of an ecosystem. Because, of course, lots and lots of people in ecology are thinking quite deeply about sustainability. So if we take this metaphor of a movement or an OER initiative or a community of inquiry as being an ecosystem that needs to sustain, is there anything we can learn about what we know about sustainability and think about ourselves as a human socio-technical ecosystem? And in particular, this is the line of argument that I'm going to go down, okay? Many people in the sustainability and socio-ecological systems world are now talking about resilience, okay? And resilience is the ability to withstand shock and change, because that's about the only thing we can count on now. Out of that has developed a more generalized notion of resilience thinking, not just about ecological systems, but resilience thinking about systems more broadly, talking about resilience platforms. That allows us to then ask, are there certain opportunities or threats for education or for OER? And that then links into the idea of collective intelligence as a key part of what a resilient socio-technical community of inquiry might be. And floating around all of this are notions to do with complexity science, and sense-making. And that's kind of the area that I come from originally. So this is an initial foray for me as well, but I'm finding it incredibly fruitful and it seemed worth sharing. Okay, so resilience is the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change and still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. Okay, there's a definition. So given a shock to the system, it doesn't crumble and break down, it's not brittle, it manages to keep functioning, but it might actually change in the process. And if you look at what they're doing in ecology, you know, they have ways of modeling an ecological system. You know, they create these three-dimensional models of an ecosystem. They say there are kind of stable attractor basins, and as long as the system manages to stay within one of these basins, it's okay. But if a shock to the system happens, then the boundaries might change, and resilience can be defined in particular ways. There's a latitude, which is the breadth of the basin. There's resistance to change, which is how deep it is relative to its latitude. There's precariousness, which is how close to this sort of watershed margin are they before this whole ecosystem will change and go through what they call a regime change. Now, so they have a whole language for talking about what happens when big stuff happens, right? Now, it may not yet be possible to model a human community in quite this way. That would be a very exciting idea. But the broader principles of resilience thinking may provide us with kind of useful strategic lenses when we're thinking about launching these kinds of programs. Okay, so from the Future of Ed website, they have a particular driver called Platforms for Resilience, and they talk about system shocks and disruptions, for example, in the areas of energy, finance, climate, healthcare. These are key forces of destabilization, and institutional strategies that focus on resisting disruption and maintaining the status quo are not going to be adequate. That's their claim. And resilience thinking lists a whole bunch of very interesting properties or principles, and I'll just step through these quickly. And some of these are, show the sort of ecological, biological roots. So a resilient world, Walker argues, promotes biological, landscape, social, and economic diversity. Diversity is critical. If you've got too much, if you're too narrow, too focused, when something changes, you find you haven't got the resource within you to adapt to that. So we might not be so worried about biological and landscape diversity within the OER movement, although there's probably an ecological dimension to what we do. But diversity of ideas, diversity of technologies, we could see a connection there. A resilient world embraces and works with natural ecological cycles. The example being that a forest that's never allowed to burn loses its fire-resistant species and becomes very vulnerable to fire. Okay. So we could again look at that and say, well, maybe we're not so worried about natural ecological cycles, but do we know anything about the kinds of cycles that an OER movement goes through, or that a new initiative goes through, or that an online community goes through? How can we work with those? A resilient world consists of modular components. So when over-connected, shocks are too rapidly transmitted through the system, and it's brittle and it breaks down. A resilient world possesses tight feedback loops. Okay? Feedbacks allow us to detect thresholds when we're getting too close to be safe, and they give the example that often, for example, in globalization, we have weak signals coming back from the developed world about the consequences of our consumption. But again, this notion of tight feedback loops is just one from systems theory, but one that we'll come back to later on. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take each of these design principles and we can use that as a lens onto what does that mean for us. Okay. This will ring some bells. A resilient world promotes trust, well-developed social networks, and leadership. Okay, well, we all talk a lot about social learning, social networks, Web 2.0, social capital, and that's a very powerful resilience factor. A resilient world places an emphasis on learning, experimentation, locally developed rules, and embracing change. We can probably all relate to that. Everybody here at this conference is innovating in some way, trying to experiment, and often frustrated with the inability to do that within more established institutional contexts. Here's one on governance. This is an interesting one. Resilient world. And, Walker is not thinking about learning or education particularly here, but he's talking about institutions have redundancy in government structures. Too rigid, too hierarchical government can break down under too much stress. And here's one about access rights and intellectual property. Interesting. Really basically talking about the tragedy of the commons and the need for, there's some thinking about this from a resilience perspective. And finally, one, again, going back to a more ecological route, it considers all of nature's unpriced services. So when we think about carbon storage, water filtration, the focus that this lens brings says, well, we need to think about these things. We often ignore the cost of those. But when you get a big shock to the system, suddenly they become terribly important. And we might, again, ask ourselves, is there a metaphor here? Are there unpriced services that the current educational paradigm takes for granted, but which suddenly become under the spotlight when the rules start to change? Okay. And we can now move to thinking about resilience platforms. And the Knowledge Works Foundation site makes that a primary kind of driver. Okay. Now, when we're talking about systems where knowledge and understanding are key variables, I think resilience then focuses on a capacity for learning. And what I'm now going to do is just show work that's going on now to take these resilience principles, and we could say, well, let's think about the current educational paradigm. To what extent are they undergoing shock and change at the moment? Because they are violating these resilience thinking principles. Okay? So violating one of these principles could threaten the established educational paradigm in the following way. But that may also be an opportunity for OER or for open social learning more broadly. But similarly, as soon as we start to do something, we should turn that lens upon ourselves and ask, to what extent are we being resilient in the way we implement these things? And this is from on my blog. This is an open Google document that I've put up where I'm starting to take some of these and show how they play out when you start to examine them. So this notion of modularity, we could pick on accreditation and say that accreditation is often tied to very large granular sizes, whereas the mass personalization paradigm expects much smaller customizable units. So when we look at what we're doing, to what extent can we accredit in more flexible ways that still have credibility? We have the drumbeat badge lab going on. In the UK, we have this notion of accrediting prior experience and learning. And I won't go through this in detail, but we can think about feedback loops and so forth. So there's a broader document on my blog which starts to play some of that out. And we're also starting to think about how some of these principles down the left-hand side might apply in a kind of collective intelligence infrastructure. So if we think about diversity, then we want to support disagreement as well as agreement. If I have a best practice or an OER, I should also be able to find out who didn't find it useful and what is there to learn from that. And in the paper, there is a more detailed table about that. In the paper, we also start talking about how a resilient community deals with complexity that feels overwhelming. And we know from quite a lot of the literature that certain kinds of phenomena happen. So many organizations celebrate their best practices, but don't pay attention to exceptions and failure cases. Whereas complexity science tells us that it's often those cases that are signals that something's not quite right. If you employ experts, the danger of experts is that they see something and they just categorize it, oh, that's one of those things, and put it in a box. But they actually fail to recognize that it's something novel. Okay. Another example would be, many small signals can build over time. So if there are many small signals within the OER movement about some phenomenon, to what extent can this infrastructure help us spot those? Okay. I'm going to fly through the rest now. Basically, this is the approach we're taking as we try to build a technical infrastructure to try and reflect these kinds of perspectives. We have all sorts of documents out there, and we have Google Analytics about how they're being used, and we have social network analyses that perhaps show who is talking to who. The question is, what does this mean? Okay? So if I read one of your papers, I might see something terribly significant in it that you didn't even say. But I'm making a connection between something you read, something you wrote, and something that I know about. And we need a way of expressing those interpretations. So I might highlight certain things in this world and say, I think this is really interesting for the following reason. But at the same time, my interpretation is not necessarily your interpretation. So there may be different interpretations on the same phenomenon. And what we're doing is building a way of making meaningful connections between those as well, using a tool that I'll show very briefly, that might say, well, I think that this is showing something that would have predicted what that person observed down here. And what this person reports here seems to cause that. But equally, this proposal somebody put out there seems inconsistent with what they were saying. Right? So these deeply meaningful connections that people are making between fragments that are otherwise isolated are the ones we're trying to merge together. And since I have 0 time left, I'm going to show you, in a series of screenshots. Well, I'm just going to finish here. Okay, we have a tool called Cohere. We're going to be demoing it in Drumbeat. You saw a glimpse of it when Anna DeLido gave a presentation before lunch around that, and we're happy to talk about it further. But basically, the screenshots show how you can weave a web of connections on top of the web, filter these semantically, set up agents to watch the network. You might say, I want to know about anybody who disagrees with this publication. Okay? And it will send you an alert when somebody disagrees. You can't ask Google that question. And we can mash it up with Google Maps to show spatial views or timeline views. So this is our coherent, our collective intelligence infrastructure. And right now we're analyzing 120 reports from the Hewlett Foundation of progress around open educational projects. And in spring next year, we'll be presenting basically a map of a picture of the OER movement, what we currently know about it, what the unresolved issues are, and opening that up for wider discussion. So there's the summary of where we've been. Sorry for taking an extra minute. Thank you.
Hi, if you don't mind, I think it would be best if we take the 5 minutes of questions now, so it's nice. So, any of you has any questions for Simon? Because you presented two great things, the resilience and also the project, the OER project. It's going to be very interesting having the landscape. Okay, go ahead.
Do systems that generally end up being resilient start out that way? And do you know? how are they formed? Are they, I don't know the terms for it, I'm a novice in the area, but if you have a resilient system, what are its beginnings look like? How is it formed?
Well, it has the capacity to be resilient if it satisfies some or all of those properties that I stepped through, I think the argument would be. I mean, when it starts out, it hasn't experienced a shock. I mean, if you think of biological systems, then, of course, the environment is changing all the time, and they're constantly adapting to their changing environment. And the challenge for us is how do we build social and technical architectures that can be that responsive and agile? So, the internet would be a prime example. The internet has very particular properties that have enabled it to survive and do what it does today, doing things that the inventors never conceived originally, because they adhered to these principles. And it's patterns and properties like that we need to think about when we're trying to make, transformational changes in this case, in the educational system. Yeah.
You seem to have the idea that a resilient system is a good system.
Yep. I guess that's a claim, yeah.
I'd say one of the most resilient systems we have is the industrial model of education. It's extremely resilient.
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking about resilience for change. And I'm thinking that it would be better if it wasn't so resilient. So I don't agree that resilience is necessarily
resilience per se.
a good
Okay.
system.
Right. So, if I organize a hugely effective terrorist network, which is highly resilient to counter-terrorism, then resilience is a bad thing, right? I mean, intrinsically, it's a good thing. It's allowing the system to survive threat. But the ends to which it's put. So, for those of us for whom the current educational system is increasingly unfit for purpose, well, it's resilient, but the question is, do we believe in the ends? So, yeah, Al-Qaeda is highly resilient.
But resilient studies should know how to break them down as well as keep them going.
Yep. And people who are working on, the counterterrorism experts are, of course, doing precisely that. They're trying to figure out how you destabilize a resilient architecture.